We're ready for the radial arm saw.
Alright, today we're going to be going over the radial arm saw. Once again, going back over those generic safety rules that exist on all the machines. We're going to make sure we have our safety glasses on, we have closed-toed shoes on, we don't have anything loose hanging about that could get caught in any moving mechanisms on the radial arm saw. The instructor, myself or Glor, has demonstrated this and went over all the proper protocol for utilizing it. You have passed the safety test when doing so. We're not working on a littered floor. There is no one distracting you while you are using it, nor are you talking to someone else while using it. We are not making any mechanical adjustments while the machine is running. So, basic components of the radial arm saw. Just like every other machine in here, it has a base. Coming up from the base, the next thing is the blade height adjustment handle. It's written on here, up, so you turn it clockwise, will raise the blade out of the table. Left or counterclockwise is going to drop the blade down further into the table. We want the blade actually riding in the table, creating this curve. You want it 1/8 of an inch into the table. This is the lower blade guard, upper blade guard. An anti-kickback device actually goes right here, which has been removed. We'll go over that momentarily. Handle, on-off switch, miter gauge, motor, yoke, radial arm, column. Another item that I forgot to mention is our fence. That's imperative. We have to know where the fence is. Obviously, this is the table as well. Okay, so first and foremost, when working with the radial arm saw, it's notorious for kickbacks. That is because once you turn the saw on, the saw is spinning at maximum speed. And then as you start to progress the blade into the wood, it's going to gain traction and try to run out at you a little bit. Now that's kind of an aggressive statement. It's not really going to run out at you, but you do have to resist the saw from wanting to come out so that you are in control of the saw versus the saw making the cut on its own. Okay? So, as you can see up here, never rough cut anything less than 12 inches. Okay? That's primarily for our planing process and our joining process. So that does say rough cut. So we can make some rough cuts over here. What a rough cut would be is we're making a cut and it does not have a smooth jointed edge. That means it's not we're cutting to a random length. It's not an exact cut. The cut may not be square when we're making that cut either. That's because we have not had a good jointed edge or a working edge when using it. Okay? If we want a good square cut on the radial arm saw, we have to make sure we have a jointed edge, which I've marked here with an X, also referred to as a working edge. So anytime we're wanting to make any type of square cut or accurate cut on any of the saws in the shop, we're going to make sure we have a jointed edge or a working edge so that we're making good, square, accurate cuts. Safety margin on the radial arm saw is 6 inches. As you guys can see here, this has been hatched out on the table, 6 inches in each direction. That's making sure that our hands are staying outside this safety margin and we are aware of where that is located. When cutting with this, a lot of times you'll place your hands outside the safety margin, but if you're not used to curling your thumb up, how I say to do it is keep your finger in line with your thumb. You don't get used to putting your thumb out like that. You want to have those in line with one another anytime you're working. That way you're always have your fingers and thumbs the same distance away from the radial arm saw. This would be the closest I could actually be to the blade and still make a cut on this. If I want to make multiple cuts to the same length, I'm going to utilize this. I don't know if you can see that or not, but on there it's written stop block. So if I need to cut multiple boards to a length, say it's 12 inches, I can set that to 12 inches, slide me a board up there. I could cut it at 12 inches. Once I remove that piece, I can slide it up here again, make another cut, make repetitive cuts to the same exact length, utilizing a stop block. proper way to cut with this. We're going to make sure the saw is pushed all the way to the rear. We're going to have our hand on the handle. We're going to turn the saw on. We're going to wait for it to reach maximum speed. It might take just a second for it to reach maximum speed. Then when we cut, I'm not actually going to make this cut, but I'm holding the board here so that you can see it. We're going to pull the blade at least the radius of the blade through the board. Why we want to do that? The lowest point of the blade into the table is at the radius of the blade. So we want to pull it at least the radius of the blade through the board. Then we're going to return it all the way to the rear. Shut the machine off and allow the machine to slightly slow before we remove our hand. We do not have to wait for it to come to a complete stop. We want the saw blade to start to slow before we remove our hand from the handle. That's just in case there's a small piece laying back there or something that it could come in contact with. With that being said, if you are cutting small minuscule pieces off the end of a board, it could become a projectile. You are not doing anything wrong. That's just the nature of cutting a small piece off, and it could get thrown back off the wall or something like that. It's one reason why we're wearing our safety glasses, and we're cognitive of that. So we want to make sure we're aware of that. So in the event that if it did happen, you know that you're not doing anything wrong. It does occasionally happen. Okay, now I'm just going to go through the process of making a cut from the beginning to the end. Earlier I mentioned the anti-kickback device that has been removed. The anti-kickback device is used only when ripping on the radial arm saw, which we do not do in this shop because we have a table saw. It has been completely removed from the saw. On the safety test, you want the anti-kickback device to be up and out of the way when using the radial arm saw for cross-cutting, because once again, it is only used for a rip cut, which we only use our radial arm saw for cross-cutting. So when I'm approaching the saw to make this cut, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I have my jointed edge back against the fence. I'm going to make sure that the blade is down within the table. Once again, this raises the blade. One of the benefits of the radial arm saw is that it does not have to cut all the way through the material. So somebody else before you may have used it and maybe cut a rabbet or something along those lines where they're not cutting all the way through the material. So we're just going to make sure that it's down in the table so that we're sure that we're cutting all the way through the material. Mine has a stop on it, and so does Mr. Glore's, so you cannot drop it too far into the table. Once again, I have my jointed edge back against the fence. I've positioned myself so I'm not directly in line with the saw. We are never directly in line with any saw blades or knives or cutter heads in the shop at any time. So we're off to the left-hand side of the saw. Our left hand is pushing back against the fence. Once again, we have our finger and thumb in line with one another, so we're not sticking that thumb out. We have the saw pushed all the way to the rear. Our right hand is on the handle. Our left hand is removed to turn the saw on, and we're going to wait for it to reach maximum speed. So what I did there, once again, I turned the saw on. I pulled the saw out. It meets the radius of the blade so that it would cut all the way through the material. Once I cut all the way through the material, I return the saw all the way to the rear, shut it off, wait for it to slow, and then I would let go of it. We're going to wait till the saw completely stops to remove the scrap wood. You can bump it out to the side a little bit if you would like, but we're not going to put our hand anywhere inside the safety margin until it has come to a complete stop. At that point, you will remove the scrap wood, and I will have a scrap wood box right here. We'll toss that scrap wood into that scrap wood box. When done, make sure you clean off any debris for the next person. You're not leaving anything sit up here, scrap wood, tape measures, or anything. We never have any tools on our working surface when we are utilizing the machine.
Alright guys, today we're going to talk about the miter saw. What we have here is actually a 12-inch sliding compound miter saw. What that means is, one, it's going to slide. and it does a compound miter, so I can rotate the saw to do a bevel cut, or I can rotate the table to do a miter cut, so that would be a compound miter. So depending on which situation you find yourself in for your project, you might have to do one or the other or both. Typically compound miters are going to be doing more crown molding cuts and things like that. First, let's talk about some of the different parts. First, we have the locking pin right here. So the way this is set up right now is the default position. So when you come up to the saw, it should be down in the lock position. You're going to push down on the handle and pull this little pin out, and that'll unlock it and allow the blade to be ready to use. We have a fence and a table, just like we have on most other machines, like the radial arm saw. Back here we can see our bevel gauge. This is going to tell us what angle the saw is tilted at side to side. Up front we have our miter gauge, which is going to tell us what angle the table is rotated at. Now there are predetermined spots. You can see those notches in there. It'll lock in place there, and then on the front of this handle you push that down and that locks it in place. So if you wanted to cut an angle that did not have one of those predetermined spots, if I wanted to cut a 10-degree angle, for example, I would set that at 10 degrees here and then lock that handle, and I can cut any kind of odd angle from 0 to 60 on this side, 0 to 50 on the left side. We also have a clamp right here. This is going to be beneficial when you have a wider board or a smaller board, maybe something that's harder to hold on to. What we run into issues with on these wider boards is when you push down on it, it wants to lift the board up and cause kickback. So this just swung around there and gets tightened up, and that will hold the board in place for you so it doesn't lift up during the cutting process. And then it just swings out of the way. What you always want to make sure you're doing to help prevent that kickback also is making sure that your hand is pushing down where you have table. So notice this void of table right here. You don't want to push down because that's going to lift the board up. It's going to create a seesaw effect and lift that board up. So you always want to hold down where that table is. Okay? Margin of safety on this is also 6 inches, so it's similar to a lot of similarities from this saw to the radial arm saw. It is used for cross cuts only. The advantage of this one over the radial arm saw is we can do all of those mitered cuts. Right here we have our blade guard. So this is automatically retracted when you push down and go into your cut. You don't ever want to manually adjust the blade guard. It's going to do all the work for you. Up here we have a switch, and on top we have a light. So there's a light switch here and then the trigger switch to turn the saw on. The light isn't necessarily there to show our work, but the light in this situation casts a shadow where our cut is going to be. That's extremely beneficial because that is exactly where the blade is going to cut. So that's how you'll line up your mark. So you'll have a small mark on your board, you line that up with your mark, and then you can make your cut without having to actually bring the blade all the way down. It makes it a lot easier and faster. So if I have a narrow board like this one here, the slide is not really beneficial to me. In fact, it can actually cause kickbacks if you come out too far, because what you're creating is the teeth pulling the board up as opposed to going straight down into the board. So on the back side here, we have a sliding lock knob right there. So that's going to lock it in place wherever it's at. So you want to push it all the way back and just turn that knob, and then it won't allow that saw to slide. So for narrow cuts, you're going to bring it all the way back, lock that in place, and then it'll prevent that from sliding on you. When you're adjusting your miter, you want to push down right here with your thumb, and that's going to allow you to slide that into those different spots it locks itself in place at 0, just because it's in one of those slots. We always want to lock it down anyway, but in order to adjust it, you have to push that down with your thumb. All right, so with the miter saw, we can make those miter cuts where we rotate the table, and we can make those bevel cuts by tilting the saw head. So if we tilt that saw, we want to make sure before we cut that we're going to clear the fence. In this situation, I would not clear the fence. So you want to make sure your fence is completely out of the way before we make our cut. And we also want to make sure this clamp is out of our way. Sometimes this clamp gets in the way of our saw in those sharper angles. So this is our 45. This is the most drastic situation we would have. So now we can see that it clearly has plenty of space to clear the fence and our clamp. Let's go ahead and make a cut. So I do have my slide locked, so it's not going to pull out. I'm going to line this up with my cut. And my stance is going to be very similar to my radial arm saw stance. I got one foot in front of the other. My right hand is controlling the saw, and my left hand is controlling the board, or holding the board down into the table and fence. Start all the way at the top. If you start down here, it's going to have enough torque to kick up, and you'll lose control of the saw. So keep it at the top. Once that blade is stopped, you can raise it back up. One thing that can happen if you bring that blade up too fast while it's still spinning is this little cutoff piece here can be caught by the teeth and be thrown off and maybe hit somebody or cause some damage. So always leave that saw blade down into the table until it stops, especially when you're cutting off small pieces. It might be a case where that small piece actually gets pushed back and it's back here in the path of the blade. So if that piece does fly out, it doesn't necessarily mean you've done anything wrong, just like on the radial arm saw, but those small pieces do get pushed back there sometimes. Really just kind of depends on the situation. Now we're going to use this wider board. We're going to make a wider cut. So for this situation, we need to unlock or make sure that lock knob is unlocked so that I can slide it forwards and backwards. I'm going to line up my cut with that shadow. Okay? And I want to, again, hold my hand where the table is, so I'm not going to push down here. Hold it right here. I'm going to pull the trigger while it's at its top position. If I pull it when it's down, it's going to kick up and the blade is exposed. So I'm going to lose control of the saw and the blade is exposed. So those things aren't good. So you're going to pull the trigger, get it in full speed, go all the way down until it stops, and then all the way back until it stops. Let go of the trigger, and then bring the saw up. Okay, so let's do all of that while making the cut. So I'm using the arbor as my guide. I draw a straight line down from that. It should be about 1 inch back behind the board. That's how far I pull it out. Start at the top. And that's a clean cut. So now I'm done cutting, so I want to remove all my scraps off the table. And there's a scrap box right here, so I'm going to make sure all my scraps make it to the scrap box. And now I'm going to set the machine back to the default setting. So I'm going to bring it down in its down position, lock it in place, turn my light off. Now I'm done.